The dust of Clearwater, New Mexico territory, had a taste. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated the tongue and settled in the back of the throat, a permanent reminder of the land's indifference. It was the taste of poverty, of endings, of thirst. Eleanor Wade had known that taste for all of her 20 years, but today it felt different. Today, it tasted of betrayal. The sun beat down on the town's sorry excuse for a street, bleaching the life from the warped planks of the general store and the sheriff's office. Clearwater was not a place of vibrant life, but of stubborn survival, a collection of souls clinging to a patch of dirt God had seemingly forgotten to bless with rain. People moved with a slow, heat-drained purpose, their faces etched with the same weary resignation as the cracked earth beneath their boots. They spoke little, and when they did, their words were as dry as the air. Silence was the town's true language, a shared understanding of hardship that needed no articulation. It was a town that knew how to look away. Eleanor felt their eyes on her now, 100 unseen glares from behind dusty window panes and from the slivers of shade in doorways. They were not looking with pity, but with a flat, morbid curiosity. They were watching a spectacle, the final act in the sad drama of the Wade family. She kept her chin up, a small, useless act of defiance that made the muscles in her neck ache. Her dress, a faded calico her mother had sewn, was clean but threadbare, a testament to a dignity she fought to maintain even as it was being stripped from her. Beside her, her Uncle Amos shuffled, his own dignity long since drowned in a bottle. The smell of cheap whiskey rolled off him in waves, fouling the hot air. He had a loose, slack-jawed grip on her arm, not tight enough to hurt, but firm enough to steer her like livestock. This was his idea, his solution. He had debts, the kind that were not settled with polite letters but with threats whispered in the dead of night by men who carried more than just their accounts in their pockets. And Eleanor, his dead brother's only child, was his last and most valuable asset. The thought was so vile, so fundamentally wrong, that it did not even feel real. It was a nightmare from which she could not wake. Her parents had been good people. Her father, a man with calloused hands and a quiet smile, had taught her to read the stars. Her mother, whose laughter was like the rare sound of a desert spring, had taught her to find beauty in the stubborn wildflowers that grew between the rocks. They had been taken by a fever 3 winters ago, leaving her in the care of a man who was already a ghost, haunted by his own weaknesses. Amos had promised to look after her. He had promised her father on his deathbed. The memory of that promise was a hot coal in Eleanor's chest. Amos cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound. "Just a little farther. Ellie, do not be difficult." Difficult, as if she had any choice in the matter. She could run, but where the desert stretched out in every direction, an ocean of sand and scrub that offered no refuge. The people of Clearwater would offer no help. They would bolt their doors and pretend not to hear her pleas. They had seen too much trouble to invite more. In this land, a woman alone was a tragedy waiting to happen. So she walked, her worn boots scuffing up little puffs of that tasteless dust, each step taking her further from the girl she had been and closer to whatever she was about to become. They stopped in the center of the town square, an open patch of ground where the gallows stood as a stark reminder of the only real law that mattered here. The sun was merciless. She could feel sweat trickling down her spine. Amos let go of her arm and nervously wiped his palms on his trousers. He was a small man, made smaller by his addiction, his eyes constantly darting about, unable to meet anyone's gaze, least of all hers. "He will be here soon," Amos muttered, more to himself than to her. "He is a man of his word." Eleanor said nothing. Words were useless now. All the pleading, all the tears, had been spent in the dark corners of their small, suffocating shack over the past week. She had begged him to find another way, to work, to sell what little they had left, but he had already sold everything. Now, he was selling her soul to save his skin. She looked at the faces that were now becoming bolder. Creeping out from the shadows, the blacksmith, Mr. Abernathy, stood with his arms crossed over his massive chest, his expression grim but unmoving. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, peered out from behind a stack of barrels. Her lips pursed in disapproval, but her body planted firmly on her side of the street. They were witnesses, not saviors. Their silence was a verdict. They had judged her situation and found it was not their concern. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She was being sold, like a sack of flour or a lame horse, and the world simply watched. Then, a change rippled through the small crowd. A murmur went up, and people shuffled back, clearing a path. A carriage was approaching, a fine, black carriage pulled by two magnificent black horses that seemed to absorb the very light of the sun. They moved with a powerful, confident gait that was utterly alien to this town of weary shuffles. The carriage was polished to a high sheen, reflecting the harsh sunlight in blinding flashes. It was a vehicle from another world, a world of wealth and power that had no place in Clearwater. The carriage pulled to a halt, and the driver, a stoic man with a face like carved granite, remained motionless. The door opened, and a man stepped out. Silas Vane. The stories about him were the closest thing Clearwater had to folklore. He was the Baron of Black Ridge Manor, a fortress of stone that loomed over the territory from its perch in the distant, hazy mountains. He was impossibly wealthy, having made a fortune in silver mining, they said. But the whispers were always darker than that. They spoke of a wife who had vanished without a trace years ago. Some said she had run off. Others, in hushed tones after a few drinks at the saloon, said Vane had killed her himself, that her ghost still walked the halls of that cold, stone house. He came to town only when necessary, a silent, imposing figure who conducted his business and left without a word to spare. He was a phantom, a boogeyman used to frighten children. And now, he was standing before her. He was taller than she had imagined, dressed in a tailored black coat that must have been suffocating in the heat, yet he showed no sign of discomfort. His face was sharp, angular, with a strong jaw and a mouth that was set in a firm, unsmiling line. His eyes were the most striking thing about him. They were a pale, cold gray, like a winter sky, and they seemed to miss nothing. He looked at Amos with an expression of faint disdain. Then his gaze moved to Eleanor. She braced herself for the look she expected, the leering appraisal of a man buying flesh. But it was not there. His eyes swept over her once, a quick, detached assessment that was somehow more unnerving. It was the look a man gives a horse, checking its teeth and legs before a purchase. There was no heat in it, no malice, just a cold, calculating consideration. In that moment, she was not a woman. She was an acquisition. "Wade," Silas Vane said. His voice was deep and steady, without warmth or inflection. It was the sound of rocks grinding together. Amos practically bowed, wringing his hands. "Mr. Vane, sir, punctual as always. She is here, just as we agreed. A good girl, strong, a hard worker." He gave her a little push forward, as if presenting a prize hog at the county fair. Eleanor stumbled but caught her balance, her face burning with shame. She would not be prodded. She straightened her back and met Silas Vane's gaze directly. She would not cower. It was the only thing she had left. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his gray eyes unblinking. She saw a flicker of something in their depths, something she could not name. It was not surprise. Not exactly. It was more like a quiet acknowledgement, as if he saw the flicker of defiance in her and filed it away as a piece of information. Then, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. The sound of coins clinking together was obscenely loud in the silent square. He did not count them. He simply tossed the pouch to Amos, who fumbled and caught it against his chest, clutching it like a drowning man clutches a piece of driftwood. From the same pocket, Silas Vane produced a single, heavy coin, a silver dollar. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, the eagle on its face glinting in the sun. "This is for the girl," he said, his voice carrying easily to the watching townspeople, so that it is understood she was not given, but bought, a clean transaction. He did not hand it to her. He did not toss it to her. He simply let it drop. The coin fell through the still, hot air, turning over and over, catching the light. It hit the dusty ground with a sharp, metallic clink. The sound cut through the silence, sharp and final, like the turning of a key in a lock. It was the sound of her life being signed away. For a heartbeat, everyone stared at the coin lying in the dirt. It was a symbol of her worth, of her price, lying there to be trampled underfoot. Eleanor's vision blurred. The coin, the dust, the silent faces, all swirled into a meaningless haze. She felt a profound and dizzying sense of detachment, as if she were watching this happen to someone else, some other poor girl whose name she did not know. Amos, his greed overcoming any lingering shred of decency, scurried forward and snatched the coin from the ground, wiping it on his shirt before adding it to the pouch. He did not look at her. He could not. He turned and scuttled away, disappearing into the saloon without a backward glance, clutching his 30 pieces of silver. He had made his choice. The transaction was complete. Silas Vane gestured toward the carriage with a slight inclination of his head. It was not a request. It was an order. "Come." She did not move. Her feet felt rooted to the spot where her life had just been sold. The part of her that still remembered her mother's smile and her father's story screamed in silent protest. But the part of her that had learned to survive in Clearwater knew that the scream was a luxury she could not afford. She took a breath, the dusty air searing her lungs, and she walked. She walked past the silent blacksmith and the disapproving storekeeper's wife. She walked with her head held high, her eyes fixed on the black carriage that waited like a hearse. She did not look back at the town. It was no longer her home. It had never really been one. It was just a place where she had lost everything. The driver opened the carriage door for her. The interior was dark and cool, upholstered in rich leather that smelled of polish and money. It was another world. She climbed inside, her rough calico dress a stark contrast to the opulence of her new prison. She sat on one side, as far from the center as she could get. Silas Vane entered after her, his large frame filling the space, making it feel smaller, more confining. He sat opposite her, his back ramrod straight, his hands resting on his knees. He did not look at her. He simply tapped on the roof, and the carriage lurched forward. They rode in silence. The clatter of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth and the creak of the leather suspension were the only sounds. Through the window, Eleanor watched Clearwater shrink until it was just a meaningless smudge on the horizon. The landscape began to change, the flat, scrubby desert giving way to rolling hills and jagged rock formations that clawed at the sky. They were heading toward the mountains, toward the dark silhouette of Black Ridge. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and crimson. The light streamed through the carriage window, bathing Silas Vane's impassive face in a bloody glow. He looked like a king from some dark, forgotten legend, a man carved from shadow and stone. He had bought her. She belonged to him now. Eleanor turned her face to the window, watching the last of the light bleed from the sky, leaving behind a deep, bruised purple. The desert was vast and empty, and for the first time, she felt a kinship with it. She, too, was vast and empty. But as the carriage climbed higher into the mountains, a tiny, hard kernel of something formed within her. It was not hope. It was something tougher, more resilient. It was resolve. They had taken her freedom, her name, her future. But there was one thing they could not buy and could not take. Inside, in the silent secret core of her being. She was still Eleanor Wade, and she would survive. The sun vanished completely, and as the carriage rolled on into the encroaching darkness, The twilight cast long shadows that looked like bars across the wounded land. The wheels of the carriage ground against gravel as they made their final ascent. The road had become a narrow, winding track cut into the side of the mountain, with a sheer drop on one side that fell away into a black, star-flecked void. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the house that was slowly resolving itself out of the gloom ahead. Black Ridge Manor was not a house. It was a wound in the landscape, a jagged fortress of dark gray stone that seemed to have grown from the mountain itself. Its lines were sharp and severe, with tall, narrow windows that looked like vacant eyes staring out into the endless night. No lights burned within them. The wind, which had been a hot breath on the desert floor, was a cold, sharp-edged thing up here, and it moaned around the turrets and chimneys, a lonely, mournful sound. It was a house built to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep something in. The carriage rolled to a stop before a pair of immense oak doors, bound with black iron. The driver did not move until Silas Vane tapped the roof again. Then the man dismounted, his movements economical and silent, and opened the door for his master. Silas stepped out into the biting wind, his black coat whipping around him. He did not offer Eleanor a hand. She gathered her worn skirts and descended on her own, her boots landing softly on the stone courtyard. The air was thin and cold, and she shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, as if summoned by their arrival. One of the massive doors creaked open, spilling a weak, yellow rectangle of lantern light onto the stones. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was old, bent slightly at the shoulders, and dressed in simple, dark clothing. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and his white hair was thin, but it was his eyes that held her. They were dark and deep-set, and they held a profound, bottomless weariness, the look of a man who had seen too much and spoken of none of it. "Harris," Silas said, his voice flat. It was not a greeting, but a statement of fact. The old man, Harris, gave a short, stiff nod. He looked from Silas to Eleanor, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. There was no welcome in his eyes, nor was there any malice. It was a look of pure, unadorned observation, as if he were memorizing her face, cataloging her as a new piece of furniture, another object to be tended to in this silent stone mausoleum. He stepped back, holding the lantern high to light their way inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the great door closed behind her with a deep, booming thud that echoed through the cavernous space. The sound was horribly final. The entrance hall was vast, the ceiling lost in the shadows far above. A grand staircase of dark, polished wood swept upwards into the gloom. The air was cold, not just with the mountain chill, but with a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to seep from the very stones. It smelled of dust, beeswax, and something else, something faint and unsettling, like dried flowers left too long in a sealed room. Their footsteps echoed on the flagstone floor, the only sound besides the ceaseless cry of the wind outside. Silas handed his coat and hat to Harris, who took them without a word. The old man's silence was absolute. It was not the quiet of a reserved man, but a complete and total absence of voice, as if his vocal cords had been surgically removed. "Harris will show you to your room," Silas said to Eleanor, his attention already elsewhere as he scanned a stack of letters on a heavy wooden table. "He will bring you a tray. We keep to a schedule here. Dinner is at 8 o'clock precisely. In the dining hall. Do not be late." He did not look at her as he spoke. He dismissed her as easily as he had dismissed the carriage driver. Harris raised his lantern, the light casting long, dancing shadows, and gestured for her to follow him up the stairs. She hesitated for a second, looking at the broad, unmoving back of the man who now owned her. He did not turn. She was a parcel that had been delivered and signed for. Now she was to be put away. With a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she followed the old, silent man up the grand, creaking staircase. He led her down a long, wide corridor, their path illuminated by the small, flickering pool of his lantern, Portraits of stern-faced men and women with cold, judgmental eyes watched them pass, their painted faces seeming to shift in the unsteady light. Harris stopped before a door and opened it, stepping aside to let her enter. The room was larger than the entire shack she had shared with her uncle. A large bed with a heavy, carved headboard dominated the space, covered with a thick quilt. There was a wardrobe, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a small fireplace where a low fire was already crackling, offering the only spot of warmth and life in the entire house. The single tall window was bare, looking out onto nothing but blackness. It was a comfortable room, a luxurious room by any standard she had ever known, and yet it felt like a cell. Harris placed the lantern on a small table, its light pushing back the shadows. He then turned to her and, for the first time, his expression changed. He raised a hand and pointed down the long hallway they had just come from, in the direction of the main staircase. Then he slowly, deliberately, drew his hand across, pointing in the opposite direction, toward the darker, unlit end of the hall. He shook his head once, a small, sharp, negative gesture. His weary eyes met hers, and they held a clear, unmistakable warning. Then he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone in the crushing silence of the house of stone. The days that followed fell into a strange, rigid rhythm. She learned the rules of the house not through spoken words, but through the unyielding structure of her new life. Dinner was always at 8, served by Harris in a dining hall so vast and empty that the two of them, seated at opposite ends of a 30-foot table, felt like lost souls in a cathedral. They ate in complete silence, the scrape of silverware against porcelain the only sound. Silas never spoke to her during these meals, and she did not dare speak to him. His presence was an immense, oppressive weight. She also learned the unwritten rules. She was not to ask questions about anything, especially not about the past, and she was to stay away from the West Wing. The warning from Harris had been clear. The main hall branched in 2 directions, and the west corridor was always dark, a place of shadows and closed doors. A palpable sense of sorrow seemed to emanate from it, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath around that wing, waiting. Eleanor spent her days exploring the parts of the manor that seemed permissible. She found a library filled with thousands of books, their leather spines cracking with age. She ran a finger along them, the names of poets and historians, a connection to a world of thoughts and ideas that felt 1,000,000 miles away. It was in the library, on her 4th day, that Silas Vane finally spoke to her about something other than the time of a meal. She was standing by a large globe, tracing the outline of the continents with her finger. When he entered, she had not heard him approach. He moved with a predator's silence. "You can read," he stated. It was not a question. She turned, startled, her heart leaping into her throat. "Yes, my father taught me." He walked to the massive stone fireplace and stared into the flames. A useful skill. He was quiet for a long moment, and she felt a tension in the room, a gathering of unspoken things. This is a house of ledgers and accounts, Miss Wade, of contracts and correspondence. My business does not stop simply because I reside on top of a mountain. He turned his head and his cold, gray eyes pinned her in place. "I have need of a secretary, someone to manage my letters. The position requires a steady hand and a quiet tongue. It is work you are capable of doing." Eleanor stared at him, confused. He had bought her, but not for this. She had expected servitude, drudgery, the grim duties of a housekeeper, or something far worse. She had not expected to be offered a position of clerical trust. He seemed to read her thoughts. A flicker of something that might have been bitter amusement crossed his face. "You misunderstand your purpose here. I did not purchase a bed warmer. I purchased a presence, an arrangement, the details of which do not concern you." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "What should concern you are the rules of this house." She swallowed. her throat dry. "I understand. Dinner at 8, no questions, and I am not to go into the West Wing." His face hardened at the mention of the forbidden wing, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "You are observant? Good." He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. And for the first time she felt the sheer physical power he held in check. He was not just a rich man. He was a dangerous one. He stopped a few feet from her, his voice dropping to a low, resonant timbre that sent a shiver down her spine. "At 20, you were sold to me," he said, the words precise and cold as ice. "You came to this house as property, a line item in a ledger to settle a drunkard's debt." He let the ugly truth of it hang in the air between them, stark and brutal. Then his expression shifted, becoming something complex and unreadable, a deep shadow of weariness passing through his eyes. "But what you find inside this house might just shock everyone, including me." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. They changed everything. This was not a simple transaction. It was not about a man buying a woman. There was something else here, a deep, entangled story she had just been thrust into the middle of. The famous, chilling phrase from the town's whispers was not just a rumor. It was a warning, delivered by the man himself. It was a challenge, and it was an admission of something she had not expected, that he, Silas Vane, the master of this stone kingdom, was not entirely in control of it. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her, but beneath it, that hard kernel of resolve she had found in the carriage began to burn. He thought of her as property, an object, but objects did not think, objects did not plan, objects did not feel a rising tide of defiance that was equal parts terror and a grim, burning curiosity. She was not just a victim in this story. She was a participant. Her survival, she realized with stark clarity, would not depend on meek obedience. It would depend on her mind, on her ability to see the things she was not meant to see and to understand the things that were never said. She would work for him. She would write his letters and copy his ledgers. She would be the perfect, quiet secretary. And she would watch, and she would listen. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I will need paper and ink," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "if I am to be your secretary." A long, silent moment passed between them. He searched her face, and she felt as if he were peeling back the layers of her skin, looking for the truth of her in her bones. Finally, he gave a single, curt nod. "Harris will provide you with what you need." He turned and walked out of the library, leaving her alone with the silent books, the crackling fire, and the echo of his shocking pronouncement. That night, sleep would not come. She lay in the large, cold bed, listening to the wind howl its lonely song around the eaves of the manor. The house groaned and settled around her like a living beast. She thought of his words, turning them over and over in her mind. What could be in this house that could shock everyone? What secret was so terrible that its owner spoke of it with such a strange, almost fatalistic warning? Her thoughts inevitably drifted to the West Wing, the dark, silent heart of the house's mystery. It was then that she heard it. At first, it was so faint she thought it was a trick of the wind, another of the house's mournful sighs. She sat up in bed, holding her breath, listening. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, muffled by stone walls and distance, but it was unmistakable. It was the sound of someone weeping, a desolate, heartbroken sobbing that seemed to carry all the sorrow in the world. It was a woman's cry, and it was coming from the forbidden depths of the West Wing. The sound rose and fell, a ghostly lament that slid under her door and wrapped its icy fingers around her heart. Eleanor sat frozen in the darkness, her blood turning to ice, listening to the echoes of a grief that this house of stone was determined to keep secret. The crying became a nightly ritual, a ghost in the architecture of her sleep. It would begin long after the last embers in her fireplace had faded to gray, a sound so faint at first that it might have been the wind sighing in the chimney, but it always grew, coalescing from the silence into a thread of pure, feminine misery. It was a sound that did not belong in a house occupied only by two silent men and her. The grief was too raw, too immediate. It was the sound of a wound that would not heal. Eleanor would lie awake, rigid in the darkness, her knuckles white where she gripped the quilt. She would listen until the first pale hint of dawn touched the sky, at which point the weeping would fade, dissolving back into the silence as if it had never been. By day, she was the perfect secretary. Harris would leave a tray with fresh ink, sharpened quills, and crisp paper outside her door each morning. After a solitary breakfast, she would go to the library, where a stack of letters and ledgers awaited her on the great oak desk. Silas would appear sometime in the mid-morning, never entering fully but standing in the doorway, a tall, dark specter against the light of the hall. He would issue his instructions in a low, clipped voice, dictating replies to business associates in cities she could only imagine, like Denver and San Francisco. Her handwriting, practiced and neat, filled page after page. She learned the language of his world, a vocabulary of tonnage, assays, freight costs, and land deeds. At first, she was merely a vessel for his words, her hand an instrument for his will. But slowly, a strange kind of intimacy began to form in that cold, book-lined room. He began to stay longer, stepping inside to pace before the fireplace as he dictated, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sometimes he would stop and ask her to read a passage back to him, his gray eyes fixed on her face, listening not just to the words but to the cadence of her voice. One afternoon, she struggled with the phrasing of a particularly delicate letter regarding a disputed claim. "He is a man who responds to flattery, but despises weakness," Silas said, stopping his pacing to stand behind her chair. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the room's chill. He leaned over, pointing a long finger at the paper. "You wrote that his proposal is untenable. Change it. Write that his bold proposition requires a more robust framework to ensure mutual prosperity." His finger was close to her hand, his presence overwhelming. She could smell the scent of clean wool, leather, and the crisp mountain air that clung to him. She dipped her quill, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote his words. When she was done, he did not move away. "You have a good hand, Miss Wade," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Clear, decisive." She could not think of a reply, her throat suddenly tight. She could only nod, her eyes fixed on the wet ink. He straightened up and walked back to the fireplace, and the strange, tense moment was broken. But it left an echo, a subtle shift in the oppressive atmosphere between them. He had acknowledged her as more than a machine that could write. A few nights later, they were working late, a rare occurrence. A shipment had been delayed, and a flurry of telegrams needed to be composed. The library was lit by a single candelabra on the desk, its flames casting long, flickering shadows that made the room seem alive and breathing. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window frame, and one of the candle flames sputtered violently, nearly extinguishing before it righted itself, burning smaller and more tenaciously than before. Eleanor looked up from her paper, her eyes meeting his across the small pool of wavering light. The candlelight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing a deep weariness in his eyes that she had never seen so clearly. For a heartbeat, he was not the fearsome Baron of Black Ridge, but just a man, burdened and profoundly alone. A fragile, unspoken understanding seemed to pass between them in that flickering light, a shared acknowledgement of the darkness that surrounded them, both inside the house and out. It was as tentative and uncertain as the flame of the candle, a tiny spark of warmth in a universe of cold. The next morning, her nightly haunting had taken its toll. Her eyes were shadowed, her movements slow. As she sat down to her breakfast tray in her room, she saw it. A small, black slate lay next to her plate, the kind a schoolchild might use. Scrawled on it in neat, chalk letters were 5 words that made her blood run cold. "The house remembers." She stared at the message, her hand frozen on her teacup. It had not been there when Harris brought the tray. He must have placed it while she was washing her face. She looked up at her closed door, a profound chill settling over her. She knew who it was from. The silent, watchful old man had seen the exhaustion in her face, had understood its cause without a single word passing between them. He was not just an observer. He was a guardian of this house's secrets, and he was warning her away from them. She quickly erased the words with her sleeve, but the message remained, burned into her mind. The warning, however, had the opposite of its intended effect. It did not quell her curiosity. It stoked it into a burning obsession. The house remembered what the weeping woman, the wife who had vanished, Harris's silent plea, only confirmed that the secret was real, and it was dangerous. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was mingled with a fierce, reckless need to know. She felt like a character in one of the Gothic novels on the library shelves, a heroine trapped in a stone puzzle she had to solve in order to survive. She waited 3 more nights, forcing herself to be patient, to betray no sign of her intent. On the 4th night, the weeping began as usual, a mournful, disembodied sound that seemed to call to her. This time, she would answer. Slipping out of bed, she pulled on her dress over her thin nightgown, her fingers fumbling with the buttons in the dark. She did not bother with shoes, her bare feet making no sound on the cold wooden floor. Taking a single candle, she shielded its flame with her hand and eased her door open. The corridor was a river of shadows. She crept along the wall, every creak of a floorboard sounding like a cannon shot in the oppressive silence. The sound of the weeping was her guide, a faint, heartbreaking beacon in the darkness, drawing her toward the forbidden west wing. The air grew colder as she moved, the stone walls seeming to leach the warmth from her body. The portraits she passed by day seemed different at night, their painted eyes following her with silent, malevolent accusation. She reached the junction where the main hall split. The east wing, where her room was merely dark. But the west wing was a different kind of darkness, a solid, impenetrable black that seemed to swallow the light from her candle. The weeping was louder here, clearer. It was coming from down that hall. She took a hesitant step into the oppressive gloom, her heart hammering against her ribs. The floorboards here were thick with dust, and a smell of decay, of damp and disuse, hung heavy in the air. She moved slowly, her free hand trailing along the cold stone wall for guidance. The corridor ended abruptly at a heavy, iron-bound door. A massive iron bolt was slid across it, rusted firmly into its hasp. This was not a door meant to keep people out. It was a door meant to keep something in. She pushed against it gently, but it was as solid as the mountain itself. The crying was coming from beyond it, muffled but agonizingly close. She pressed her ear to the cold wood, and the sound of sobbing was so clear, so full of despair, that it felt like a violation to listen. Frustrated, she backed away. The door was an impassable barrier, but the warning on the slate, the story of a vanished wife, the crying, it all had to be connected. She held her candle higher, its light dancing across the walls of the small anteroom before the sealed corridor. And then she saw it. Hanging on the wall opposite the door was a large, rectangular object covered in a dusty white sheet. It was a portrait, she realized, larger than any of the others in the hall. It had been deliberately hidden from view, with a sense of dreadful purpose. She reached up, her fingers closing on the rough fabric of the sheet. She pulled. The sheet slid to the floor in a soft, dusty heap. She raised the candle, and her breath caught in her throat. Staring out from the canvas was a woman. She was beautiful, with dark, cascading hair and a dress of deep emerald green. But it was her face that made Eleanor's blood freeze. The woman in the portrait looked like her. It was not a perfect resemblance, not the reflection in a mirror. This woman's face was narrower, her expression imbued with a fragile, haunted quality that Eleanor hoped she herself did not possess. But the eyes were the same shape, the same shade of determined blue. The set of her jaw was the same, the curve of her mouth. It was like looking at a sister, a cousin, a ghost of her own bloodline. It was an impossible, terrifying likeness. The nameplate on the bottom of the gilded frame was tarnished, but she could just make out the engraved letters Lillian Vane. Eleanor stood transfixed, the candle trembling in her hand, its light making the painted woman's eyes seem to flicker with a secret, sorrowful life. This was her, the vanished wife, the woman who wept in the night. Why did she look so much like Eleanor? Was this the reason Silas had bought her to be a replacement, a living portrait to hang in his dead wife's home? The thought was so grotesque it made her feel faint. A floorboard creaked behind her. It was not the old, groaning sound of a settling house. It was the sharp, deliberate sound of a footstep. Eleanor spun around, her heart seizing in her chest. Silas Vane stood at the entrance to the West Wing corridor, not 10 feet away. He was a pillar of shadow, his face unreadable in the deep gloom, but the fury emanating from him was a palpable force, a wave of cold rage that washed over her. The fragile connection they had built over letters and ledgers, the shared moment by the flickering candlelight, it all shattered into a million pieces. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. When he spoke, his words were like chips of ice, each one striking her with brutal force. "Get out." She could not move, could not speak, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at him, the portrait of his dead wife at her back. He took a step forward, and then another, his movements slow and menacing. The faint light from her candle caught the glacial fury in his eyes. "I gave you rules, Miss Wade," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "This part of the house is not for you. What is here is not your concern. You will go back to your room, and you will never, ever come here again." He stopped directly in front of her, so close she was forced to crane her neck to look up at him. He was the master of the house, the Baron of Black Ridge, and she had trespassed into the heart of his darkness. He was all the terrifying rumors made flesh, and his rage was a cold, suffocating storm. He raised a hand, not to strike her, but to point back down the hall, a single, unyielding command. "Now." His order was absolute, leaving no room for argument or appeal. Eleanor finally found her legs. Clutching her candle, she turned and fled, her bare feet flying over the cold stones, not stopping until she reached the sanctuary of her room and slammed the door shut. Plunging herself into darkness, she collapsed against the door, her body shaking uncontrollably. The image of the furious man and the haunted, familiar face in the portrait burned forever into her memory. The crying from the West Wing had stopped. It was replaced by a silence that was far more terrifying. A week of glacial silence followed. The air in Black Ridge Manor became thick and brittle, a sheet of ice that threatened to crack with the slightest wrong move. Eleanor took her meals on a tray in her room. Harris left it outside her door, and she would not open it until his soft footsteps had receded down the hall. She did not go to the library. No work was brought to her. She was a prisoner in her comfortable cell, left entirely to her own thoughts. And her thoughts were a maelstrom of the furious man and the haunted portrait. The nightly weeping had ceased. Its absence was somehow more unsettling than its presence had been, leaving a void in the deep hours of the night, a silence that felt heavier and more watchful than before. Silas Vane was a ghost. She would sometimes catch a glimpse of him from her window, a tall, black-clad figure walking the stone ramparts of the courtyard, his head bowed against the wind as if carrying an immense physical weight. He never looked up. It was as if she had ceased to exist. The fragile, flickering connection they had shared in the library was gone, extinguished by her transgression. He had shown her a sliver of the man beneath the armor, and she had repaid him by driving a blade into his oldest wound. The shame of it was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth, but it was overshadowed by the gnawing, unanswered questions. Lillian Vane. Why that face? Why her face? On the seventh day, the sky began to curdle. The brilliant, hard blue of the mountain sky softened to a hazy gray, and a strange, yellow light fell over the jagged peaks. The wind, usually a clean, sharp thing, became humid and heavy, carrying the distant scent of rain and ozone. A storm was coming, not a simple mountain squall, but something bigger, something angrier. As the day wore on, the clouds thickened, roiling in from the west in a great, bruised mass. The first rumble of thunder was a low, deep vibration that seemed to come from the bones of the mountain itself. The storm broke just after dusk. It did not begin with a gentle rain, but with a sudden, violent onslaught. A bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the entire mountain in a ghastly, strobing flash, and was followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the very foundations of the manor. The windows rattled in their frames. Rain came down, not in drops, but in sheets, a solid wall of water driven against the stone by a howling wind. Eleanor stood at her window, watching the raw, elemental fury of the storm. It was terrifying, but it was also magnificent. It felt like a cleansing, a release of the suffocating tension that had gripped the house for a week. The storm was a wild, living thing, and in its presence, the rigid silence of the house seemed insignificant, and it was the storm that called to her. She did not know why, but she felt an unshakable conviction that the answers she sought were tied to this tempest. The memory of the crying, the locked door, the portrait, it all felt connected to this violent sky. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, seemed to resonate within her own chest, and she knew what she had to do. His warning meant nothing against this primal, urgent need to understand. This time she did not bother with a candle. The lightning provided its own intermittent, ghostly illumination. Barefoot again, she slipped out of her room. The house was a labyrinth of strobing light and deep, resonant shadow. The wind shrieked through unseen cracks in the stone, and the rain lashed against the windows like handfuls of gravel. She crept down the main corridor, her heart not with the frantic terror of before, but with a cold, grim resolve. She reached the west wing and stepped into its waiting darkness. The air was even colder and more stagnant than she remembered, thick with the cloying sweetness of rot and the dry, papery scent of forgotten things. A flash of lightning lit the corridor, and she saw the covered portrait, a pale, shrouded ghost against the wall. She ignored it and went straight to the heavy, bolted door at the end of the hall. She had expected it to be locked as before, but as her hand touched the cold iron, she felt it shift. The bolt was not thrown. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed. The bolt, heavy and rusted, scraped back with a tortured groan that was lost in the roar of the storm. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, opening into a darkness that felt older and deeper than the rest of the house. She stepped through the doorway. She was in a lady's sitting room. Lightning flashed again, and the scene was frozen for a brief, searing moment in her vision. The furniture was draped in white dust cloths, their shapes like sleeping, shrouded beasts. A delicate writing desk stood by the window, an overturned inkwell staining the wood like old blood. On the floor lay a silver-backed hairbrush, its bristles tangled with a few long, dark strands of hair. It was a room abandoned in haste, a life interrupted. The weeping had come from here. She was certain of it. This was Lillian's room. She moved deeper, her bare feet sinking into the thick dust of the carpet. She passed through an archway into a bedroom. A massive four-poster bed stood against the far wall, its curtains torn and hanging in dusty tatters. A wardrobe door was ajar, revealing the ghostly shapes of dresses still hanging within. But it was the small, rosewood table next to the bed that drew her. Lying upon it, next to a tarnished silver candlestick, was a small, leather-bound book, a diary. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The leather was cold and stiff. She opened it, The pages were filled with a fine, elegant script. The ink faded to a rusty brown. By the intermittent flashes of lightning, she began to read. The entries were dated 5 years prior. The early ones were full of life, of a woman deeply in love with her powerful, silent husband, in awe of the stark beauty of the mountains. But as the pages turned, a thread of sadness began to weave itself through the words. A loneliness, a fear of the vast, empty spaces, both inside the house and out. She wrote of the silence, of the way the wind sounded like a woman crying at night. Then the entries became more erratic. She wrote of shadows that moved in the corners of her eyes, of whispers she could not quite hear. She wrote of her own face in the mirror becoming a stranger's. It was the chronicle of a mind slowly, tragically unraveling in the gilded cage of Black Ridge Manor. The final entry was almost illegible, the script a frantic scrawl. It was dated the night of a great storm. The thunder calls my name. The walls are listening. He looks at me and sees a ghost. I have to get out. I have to be free. A tear slid down Eleanor's cheek, tracing a path through the dust on her skin. This was not the story of a murder victim. It was the story of a woman lost in a storm within her own mind. A storm that had mirrored the one raging outside her windows. She finally understood. The sadness was so profound it felt like her own. A floorboard groaned behind her. She did not need to turn. She knew. The storm outside had masked his approach. "I told you to stay away." Silas's voice was a low rumble, barely audible above the howling wind. Yet it cut through the noise with chilling clarity. Eleanor closed the diary and turned to face him. He stood in the doorway, drenched. Rainwater streamed from his hair and his black coat, pooling on the dusty floor around him. The lightning flashed, illuminating a face carved with a pain so deep it seemed ancient. The rage was gone, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. He looked like a man who had come to a grave. "I had to know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I had to know why she had my face." He walked slowly into the room, his wet boots leaving dark prints on the floor. He did not look at her, but at the room itself, at the shrouded furniture and the tattered bed curtains. This was her world, he said, his voice thick with unshed grief, and it became her prison. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face in the flashing light. "You do not have her face," he said, his voice raw. "You have your own, but the resemblance, God help me, the resemblance is a curse." He ran a hand through his wet hair, a gesture of profound weariness. The storm. It was a night like this, the last night. The dam of his silence, so carefully constructed for 5 long years, finally broke. He began to speak, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of long-suppressed agony. "Her name was Lillian," he began, his gaze lost in the past. "I met her in Boston. She was like a hummingbird, full of light and life, too delicate for a world as hard as this one. I brought her here, thinking my wealth could build a fortress to protect that light. Instead, this house, this mountain, it smothered her." He gestured around the decaying room. She was not made for this kind of silence. The loneliness began to eat at her. She started to see things, hear things. The doctor from Santa Fe called it melancholy, a fragility of the nerves. But it was more than that. It was a darkness, a sickness of the mind that I could not fight, that money could not cure. She was afraid of everything, of the shadows, of the wind, of me. A crash of thunder shook the house, and he flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his body. "The whispers started in town. The strange Baron of Black Ridge with his beautiful, crazy wife. They looked at me with pity, and then with suspicion. They said I was driving her mad, that I was a monster." He walked to the window, staring out at the lashing rain. Then came the storm. It was just like this one. The thunder terrified her. She was convinced the house was coming down, that the mountains were alive and screaming for her. She became frantic, hysterical. I tried to calm her, but she looked at me as if I were a stranger, a demon. She broke away from me and ran, out of this room, out of the house, into the heart of the storm. His voice broke, and he paused, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. I went after her. I searched for hours, calling her name until I was hoarse. I found her at dawn, at the bottom of the Black Creek ravine. The storm had washed out the path. She must have slipped in the dark. He turned back to face Eleanor, and in the next flash of lightning, she saw that his face was wet with more than just rain. The terrible, silent Baron of Black Ridge was weeping. "I carried her home," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. "And the town, they saw a dead wife and a husband they already feared. The sheriff came, they asked questions, but there were no answers that would satisfy them, in their eyes. I was a murderer who had gotten away with his crime." He looked at Eleanor, his defenses utterly gone, his soul laid bare. "So I locked this wing, I locked her away, locked the pain away. I thought if I could seal the memory, it might stop haunting me. But it never did. And then one day I was in Clearwater, and I saw you, standing in the sun. It was like seeing a ghost. It was Lillian's face, but with strength in the eyes where hers had held fear. It was a madness, an impulse I cannot explain. I told myself it was a business transaction, but it was not. I think I wanted to see if a face like hers could live in this house, if someone who looked like her could survive where she did not. Or maybe I just wanted to punish myself by seeing her ghost every day." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and devastating. All the fear Eleanor had ever felt for him dissolved, washed away by a wave of profound, aching compassion. He was not a monster. He was a man trapped in a tragedy, judged by a world that could not understand his grief, haunted by a love he could not save. His guilt was not for a crime he committed, but for one he could not prevent. The storm began to subside, the thunder rummering its retreat into the distant mountains. The rain softened to a steady, gentle drumming on the roof. In the relative quiet, they stood looking at each other across the decaying room, two isolated souls illuminated by the soft, flickering light of the dying lightning. The vast, terrifying chasm that had separated them was gone, replaced by a fragile bridge of shared truth. He was no longer the Baron who had bought her, and she was no longer the property he owned. They were just a man and a woman, standing together in a house of stone, no longer strangers. The aftermath of his confession was a fragile, hollowed-out peace. The storm had passed, leaving the mountain air scrubbed clean and the world outside draped in a profound, dripping silence. They had left the West Wing, leaving Lillian's ghost to its shrouded solitude, and now sat in the great hall before a newly built fire. Harris, with his usual spectral quiet, had brought a tray with a pot of tea and 2 cups, a small, humane gesture in the face of such monumental sorrow. He had looked from Silas's raw, unguarded face to Eleanor's, and a flicker of something ancient and knowing had passed through his weary eyes before he retreated back into the shadows. They did not speak. There were no words that could fill the space his story had carved out between them. Eleanor watched the flames dance, the light glinting off the untouched teacup in her hands. She saw him not as her owner, but as a fellow survivor of a shipwreck, washed ashore on the same lonely island. The fear was gone, replaced by an empathy so vast it felt like a physical ache in her chest. He had bought her likeness to punish himself, to surround himself with a constant, living reminder of his failure. It was a penance of exquisite, self-inflicted cruelty. Silas stared into the fire, his hands loosely clasped between his knees. The iron mask of the Baron was gone, and the man in its place was someone she was only just beginning to see, a man exhausted by a grief he had carried alone for 5 years. The silence was not the oppressive, icy thing it had once been. It was a shared space, a place where 2 solitudes could coexist without demand. For the first time since she had arrived at Black Ridge Manor, Eleanor did not feel like a prisoner. She felt like a witness. The peace was shattered by a sudden, frantic sound from the main doors. It was a heavy, desperate banging. Before either of them could react, the doors burst open and Harris stumbled in. The old man's eternal composure was gone, his face a mask of alarm in the firelight. His eyes were wide, and he pointed frantically back outside. A series of sharp, stabbing gestures toward the rear of the estate. He made a guttural sound in the back of his throat, a noise of pure, voiceless panic. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his lethargy vanishing as a surge of adrenaline straightened his spine. "What is it, Harris?" Harris could only point again, his desperation mounting. Silas strode to the door and peered out into the darkness. Eleanor followed, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, fearful rhythm against her ribs. She saw nothing at first but the wet, black courtyard glistening under the faint starlight. Then, a flicker of something unnatural against the dark bulk of the mountain caught her eye. An orange light, dancing and growing, reflecting off the low-hanging clouds. A smell reached her then, carried on the damp night air, the sharp, acrid scent of burning hay and wood. "The stables!" Silas breathed, the words tight with disbelief and horror. He did not hesitate. He moved with a sudden, violent purpose, grabbing a heavy oilcloth coat from a hook by the door and shrugging it on. He turned to Eleanor, his face once again a hard, emotionless mask. But his eyes burned with a new fire. "Stay in the house. Bolt the door behind me." It was an order, but she could not obey it. She watched as he and Harris disappeared into the night, their running footsteps echoing for a moment before being swallowed by the darkness. She stood frozen for a heartbeat. The image of the growing orange glow burned into her mind. The stables, the horses, the beautiful, powerful creatures she had sometimes watched from her window. Their presence one of the few signs of simple, uncomplicated life in this place of stone and sorrow. She could hear their panicked whinnies now, a faint, terrified sound carried on the wind. She could not stay inside. It was not a choice. It was a compulsion, a deep, visceral refusal to be a passive victim locked away while life was being threatened. Grabbing her thin shawl, she ran out into the cold, wet night, her bare feet slipping on the slick stones of the courtyard as she followed the horrifying, mesmerizing light. The scene at the stables was a vision from hell. The long wooden structure was engulfed in flames, a roaring, hungry beast of a fire that clawed at the night sky, sending a shower of glowing embers up into the darkness. The heat was a physical blow, pushing her back, and the roar of the blaze was deafening, punctuated by the sharp crack of splitting timbers. Silas and Harris were struggling with a hand pump near the well, a pathetic stream of water arcing uselessly against the inferno. The fire was too big, too hot, too fast. The building was already lost. But the horses were still inside. Their screams of terror were clearer now, a sound of pure agony that tore at her soul. Through the wide, open doors of the barn, she could see their shapes, dark silhouettes moving frantically against the wall of orange flame, trapped and terrified. The horses she screamed, though her voice was nearly lost in the din. Silas turned, his face black with soot, his eyes wild. He saw her, and a look of pure fury crossed his features. "Eleanor, I told you to stay inside. Get back to the house, now." But she was already moving, her eyes fixed on the trapped animals. One of them, a strong bay stallion he called Titan, reared up, his eyes white with panic, his powerful body silhouetted against the flames. She could not just stand there and watch them burn. "We have to let them out," she cried, running toward the stable doors. "It is too late. The roof is about to go," Silas yelled, starting after her. She ignored him. She ripped a piece of her skirt hem, dipped it in a trough of rainwater, and tied it around her face, the wet cloth offering a meager defense against the choking smoke. She plunged into the furnace. The heat was unimaginable, a living thing that seared her lungs and scorched her skin. The air was a thick, black poison, filled with flying embers that stung her eyes. Smoke billowed around her, reducing visibility to a few feet. The panicked horses thrashed in their stalls, their powerful hooves splintering the wood. She moved on pure instinct, her mind shutting out the terror, focusing only on the task. She fumbled with the latch on the first stall, her fingers clumsy and raw from the heat. The wood was hot to the touch. The latch gave way and she slapped the horse on the rump, screaming at it, driving it toward the open door in the hope of safety, one after another. She worked her way down the line, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming. The sound of the fire was a constant, deafening roar, the groaning of the timbers above a warning of imminent collapse. She reached the last stall. It was Titan, the big stallion. He was crazed with fear, bucking and kicking against the wood, refusing to be herded. She grabbed a fistful of his mane, pulling his head down, speaking to him in what she hoped was a calming voice, though it came out as a ragged, desperate croak. "Come on, boy. Come on, you have to go." A massive, burning beam from the hayloft above crashed to the ground directly in front of the stall door, showering them both with a cascade of sparks and embers. The way out was blocked. They were trapped. Titan screamed and reared, pulling her off her feet. She fell hard onto the hay-strewn floor. The wind knocked out of her. Above her, the main support beam of the roof, wreathed in flame, let out a final, agonizing groan. It was going to collapse. This was it. This was how she would die, burned alive in a stranger's barn. A foolish girl who thought she could defy the flames. Through the black, swirling smoke, a figure appeared in the fiery doorway. It was Silas. His face was a grim mask of determination, his eyes cutting through the haze, finding her on the floor. He moved without hesitation, leaping over the fallen, burning beam as if it were a mere puddle. "Eleanor," his voice was a raw command, cutting through her terror-induced paralysis. He reached her side in 3 long strides, grabbing her arm and hauling her to her feet. "The back wall," he yelled, pointing toward a small service door she had not seen. He half dragged, half carried her toward it, his strength a solid, grounding force in the chaos. He shoved Titan's head in the right direction, and the horse, sensing a new escape, bolted for the opening. Just as they reached the small door, the great roof beam gave way with a sound like the world splitting in two. The entire structure began to collapse inward, a tidal wave of fire and falling timber. Silas shoved her through the door with all his might, and then threw himself after her. A final, desperate lunge. They landed in a heap on the wet, muddy ground outside as the stable collapsed behind them in a final, deafening roar, sending a great geyser of flame and smoke billowing into the night sky. For a long moment, they lay there, coughing, gasping for the clean, cool, rain-filled air. The heat at their backs was still intense. The gentle drizzle of the passing storm fell on them, hissing on their heated skin and clothes, a soft, cleansing touch in the midst of the destruction. Slowly, Silas pushed himself up, his body shielding hers from the worst of the fire's heat. He looked down at her, his face inches from hers. His hair was singed. His face was a mess of soot and grime, but his eyes were blazing with an emotion she could not name. It was not anger. It was something fierce and raw and terrifyingly alive. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a hoarse rasp. She shook her head, unable to speak, her throat raw and burning. She was shaking, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that racked her entire body, a reaction to the terror and the sudden, miraculous safety. He stayed there, leaning over her, his presence a shield, until her shaking began to subside. Then, he sank down to sit on the muddy ground beside her. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the inferno slowly die. The main structure was gone, a skeleton of glowing timbers against the dark sky. The fire had been a great and terrible beast, and now it was breathing its last, its roars fading to a low, crackling sigh. The rain fell harder now, a steady, persistent drumming that sizzled and steamed where it struck the embers. It was a sound of quenching, of an ending. The fire had been a baptism. It had burned away the last of the silence, the last of the pretense. It had incinerated the roles they had been playing, the master and his property. In the face of death, there was only a man and a woman. He had saved her. She had risked everything for a principle, for the simple, decent act of saving a life. And in that, he had seen not the ghost of his lost wife, but the spirit of Eleanor Wade. Without a word, Silas reached out and took her hand. His hand was rough, calloused, and covered in soot, but its grip was surprisingly gentle. He laced his fingers through hers, a simple, profound gesture of connection. It was not a gesture of possession or control. It was a gesture of shared survival, of gratitude, of a bond forged in fire and fear. It was the first time they had touched not out of necessity or accident, but out of a shared, unspoken feeling. Eleanor held on, her small, trembling hand finding an anchor in his. She finally found her voice. A broken whisper. "The stables, they are all gone." He did not look at the smoldering ruins. He looked at her, his gray eyes reflecting the dying orange glow. A world of pain and loss and newfound clarity was in that gaze. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent affirmation of her presence, of her survival. "Everything can be rebuilt," he said, his voice low and heavy with meaning. "Except a life." The world after the fire was a landscape of ash and quietude. They had walked back to the great stone house, leaving the smoldering skeleton of the stables to the persistent, cleansing rain. They were a tableau of ruin and survival, Silas, his face a mask of soot, moving with a stiff, pained gait. Eleanor, her dress torn and stained, her bare feet muddy, her mind a strange, calm sea after the storm of terror. The adrenaline had ebbed away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the dull throb of a dozen minor scrapes and bruises. Inside the great hall, Harris met them, his ancient face etched with a concern so profound it was more expressive than any words could ever be. He looked at Silas's left arm, held tight against his body, at the way the sleeve of his coat was charred and fused to the fabric of his shirt beneath, and a flicker of alarm crossed his features. He immediately bustled away, returning moments later with a basin of warm water, clean cloths, and a small wooden box of medical supplies. "Sit," Eleanor said, her voice raspy from the smoke but firm with a new, unshakable authority. It was not a request. For once, Silas did as he was told, sinking heavily into a large chair by the fire. He looked as if the strings holding his formidable frame together had been cut. Eleanor knelt before him, taking a pair of scissors from the box. "This is going to hurt," she stated simply, beginning to cut away the ruined fabric of his coat and shirt from around the burn on his forearm and shoulder. The skin beneath was an angry, blistered red. He did not flinch, but she saw the muscles in his jaw clench, a line of white appearing around his lips. He watched her, his gray eyes unreadable in the flickering firelight, as she worked with a focused, gentle efficiency. Her hands, which had trembled with fear in the collapsing barn, were now steady. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her touch light, her movements deliberate. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, soot, and the sharp, medicinal scent of the salve she took from the box. "You are surprisingly capable, Miss Wade," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I am a survivor, Mr. Vane," she replied without looking up, smoothing the cool salve over the angry skin. "Survival requires capability." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Besides, you are not my first difficult patient. I once had to set the leg of a mule that had a temperament much like your own." A low sound, half grunt, half chuckle, rumbled in his chest. It was the first time she had ever heard anything resembling amusement from him. "I am not sure whether I should be grateful or insulted." "Both, I imagine," she said, beginning to wrap a clean linen bandage around his arm. "It will keep you humble." She finished her work, tying off the bandage with a neat knot. Her task was done, but she did not move away. She remained kneeling before him, her hands resting on her thighs, the intimacy of the moment holding them in a quiet, fragile orbit. He looked down at her, at the smudges of soot on her cheek, at the strands of hair that had escaped her braid to frame her face, at the clear, direct gaze of her blue eyes. He slowly raised his good hand, and for a terrifying, exhilarating moment, she thought he was going to touch her face. Instead, his fingers brushed against a singed lock of her hair, a touch so light it was barely there. "You should have stayed in the house," he said, his voice soft, devoid of its earlier anger. "You could have been killed." "So could you," she countered quietly. "And the horses would have died for certain. They are just animals." "Nothing is just anything, Mr. Vane," she said. "Everything that lives and breathes has a value. You taught me that yourself." She saw the question in his eyes. "Everything can be rebuilt." She quoted his own words back to him. "Except a life." He held her gaze for a long moment, and in the depths of his eyes, she saw the last of the icy walls crumble. He saw not a ghost, not a reminder of his past, but the woman kneeling before him, strong and defiant and alive. He slowly let his hand fall. The moment passed, but it left the air in the room irrevocably changed. The days that followed were a period of quiet healing. A routine settled in, but it was nothing like the rigid, silent one of before. Silas was confined to the house, his arm in a sling, his movements limited. He was a restless patient, unaccustomed to stillness, and he prowled the library and the great hall like a caged panther. Eleanor, having appointed herself his keeper, found her own voice. She learned to chide him when he overexerted himself, to meet his dark moods with a steady, unflappable calm, and sometimes, to her own surprise, with a flash of dry wit that would catch him off guard and pull another of those rare, rumbling chuckles from him. She would read to him in the afternoons from the dusty books in the library, her voice a soft, steady presence against the backdrop of the mountain silence. He would sit in a large armchair by the window, his eyes closed, and simply listen. They began to take their meals together, not at opposite ends of the monstrous dining table, but at a small, round table she had insisted Harris move into the library, close to the warmth of the fire. Their conversations were quiet, tentative things, explorations of the neutral territories of books, of business, of the world beyond their stone fortress. He never spoke of Lillian again, and she never asked. The story had been told. The ghost had been laid to rest. One rainy afternoon, about a week after the fire, he came to her as she sat mending one of her dresses by the library fire. He stood before her for a moment, silent, and then held out his hand. Lying on his palm was a small, silver locket, tarnished with age, hanging from a delicate chain. "This was hers," he said, his voice low. "It was Lillian's." Eleanor looked from the locket to his face. His expression was solemn, his eyes full of a meaning she could not quite decipher. "I do not think I should," she began, her throat tightening. "I want you to have it," he interrupted softly. "For 5 years, it has been locked away in the dark with everything else from that time. It deserves to see the light. It deserves to be worn by someone who understands what it means to choose life." He opened the locket. Inside, on one side, was a tiny, exquisitely painted portrait of Lillian, her face beautiful and fragile. On the other side was a portrait of a younger Silas, his face unlined by grief, his eyes holding a spark of hope that Eleanor had never seen there. "I am not her," Eleanor whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I know," he said, his gaze steady and clear. "That is why I am giving it to you." Her fingers trembled as she took the locket from his hand. The silver was cold against her warm skin. It felt heavy, not with its own slight weight, but with the weight of the past he was entrusting to her. He had given her his story, and now he was giving her this, a tangible piece of the love and loss that had defined him. It was a gesture of profound trust, of forgiveness, both of Lillian for leaving and of himself for not being able to save her. Eleanor closed her fingers around it, a silent acceptance of the gift and all it represented. It was as if the locket had unlocked something not just in him, but in her as well. The next morning, Eleanor woke with a new sense of purpose. This house had been a tomb, a monument to sorrow. But it was not dead, it was just sleeping, and it was time to wake it up. She started in the great hall, with a strength she did not know she possessed. She pulled back the heavy, dust-laden velvet curtains that had covered the tall windows for years. Sunlight, bright and sharp, streamed in, cutting through the gloom and illuminating a million dancing dust motes. The light was shocking at first, almost painful in its brilliance, but then it was just beautiful. It was life. Harris found her there, standing in a pool of sunlight, a determined look on her face. He stopped, his eyes wide, and stared at the uncovered windows as if seeing a miracle. Eleanor smiled at him. It was too dark in here. Harris, a house needs to breathe. The old man looked at her, then at the light, and for the first time since she had arrived, a slow, deep, genuine smile spread across his wrinkled face. It transformed him, erasing years of weariness. He gave her a short, emphatic nod of approval, and then bustled off, returning a few minutes later with cloths and lemon oil, and together, in a comfortable silence, they began to polish the gloom from the old wood. Her campaign of resurrection spread through the house. She aired out rooms that had been sealed for years, the smell of fresh mountain air chasing out the ghosts of stale memories. She gathered the dried, dead flowers from their vases and went out into the courtyard, where she found a small, neglected patch of earth by the south wall. She cleared the weeds and turned the soil, and on his next trip to the town for supplies, she sent Harris with a list. He returned with seeds for poppies and columbine and hardy mountain wildflowers. She spent hours on her knees in the dirt, planting the promise of color and life against the backdrop of the gray, unyielding stone. She was changing the house, and in doing so, she was changing herself. The timid, frightened girl who had arrived in a carriage was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own mind, who could face down fire and grief and build something new from the ashes. But as she nurtured the seeds in the cold earth, a new and troubling thought began to sprout in the quiet corners of her own heart. She watched Silas as he slowly healed, as he began to oversee the plans for a new, stone-built stable. She saw the way his eyes would follow her as she moved about the house, a look of quiet wonder in their gray depths. She felt a warmth spread through her chest when he smiled, one of his rare, true smiles, and she had to admit a terrifying, exhilarating truth. She was falling in love with him. The realization was a sharp, painful jolt. How could this be? How could she love a man who had purchased her like she was a piece of livestock? The foundation of their entire relationship was a transaction, a sordid bargain made in the dusty square of a town that despised them both. Her feelings felt real, true, and deep. But were they, or were they merely the product of gratitude he had saved her life? He had shown her a wounded vulnerability that had touched her soul. Was what she felt love? Or was it just pity for a lonely, grieving man? Was it the natural affection of a captive for a captor who had proven to be unexpectedly kind? She would lie in bed at night, her hand clutching the silver locket at her throat, and wrestle with the questions. She felt free here, freer than she had ever felt under her uncle's neglectful roof. But was it true freedom, or just the illusion of it in a larger, more comfortable cage? To love him felt like the most natural thing in the world, and the most impossible. She had been sold, but in the heart of the man everyone feared, she had found a strange and tender kindness. Now she had to wonder if, in finding that kindness, she had simply traded one form of bondage for another. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The mountain bloomed with a fierce, defiant life. Eleanor's small garden, nurtured by her patient hands, produced a riot of color against the gray stone walls. Poppies, the color of fire, and columbine as blue as the deepest twilight, nodded in the breeze. The sounds of hammers and saws echoed from the far side of the estate, where a new stable, built of stone and iron to defy any future flame, was slowly taking shape under Silas's exacting direction. The house breathed again, and so did its inhabitants. The quiet companionship that had taken root in the ashes of the fire grew into something deep and sturdy. They spoke more freely now, their conversations weaving a tapestry of shared thoughts and quiet observations. Yet, a final, invisible barrier remained. It was the world beyond the mountain. Black Ridge Manor had become their sanctuary, their island, but the mainland, with its memories and judgments, still existed, and they both knew that sooner or later, they would have to return. The need arose from practicality. The fire had consumed more than just the stables. It had taken a wealth of supplies, tools, and specialized hardware that could not be fashioned on the mountain. One morning, over breakfast in the sunlit library, Silas made the announcement, his voice carefully neutral. "I have to go into Clearwater. We need timber from the mill and custom fittings from the blacksmith. The list is long." He paused, his eyes on his coffee cup. Harris can no longer make the journey alone with such a large load. Eleanor's heart gave a sudden, heavy thud. Clearwater. The name itself was a ghost, a place of dust and shame and silent, watching eyes. The thought of returning to that square, of facing those people, was a cold dread in the pit of her stomach. She could stay here. Of course. He had not commanded her to go. She was safe in her sanctuary. But the thought of him going alone, of facing the town that had condemned him without evidence, was even colder. He had faced his past with her in the darkness of the West Wing. She would not let him face it alone in the harsh light of day. "I will come with you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked up, and, for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a silent question. He had not wanted to ask. He had not wanted to force her to confront the sight of her deepest humiliation. "It is my choice," she added, meeting his gaze. "We will go together." A look of profound, unspoken gratitude passed over his face before he gave a single, curt nod. "Be ready after breakfast." The journey down the mountain in the black carriage was a world away from her first terrifying ascent. She sat not as property being transported, but as a partner on a necessary expedition. The silence between them was not oppressive, but comfortable, a shared space of understanding. She wore a simple but well-made dress of deep blue cotton, one of several Harris had procured for her from a catalog. Around her neck, cool against her skin, lay the silver locket. It was a talisman, a reminder of all that had passed between them, of the truth she now carried. As they descended, the familiar, heat-baked landscape of the lowlands spread out before them. From this height, Clearwater looked small and insignificant. A handful of weathered buildings dropped into the vast, indifferent desert, but she knew that small places could hold the largest malice. Their arrival was an event. The sight of Silas Vane's fine carriage rolling down the main street was enough to stop the town in its tracks. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. The slow, heat-drugged rhythm of the day was broken. Mr. Abernathy, the blacksmith, stopped his hammering, his massive arm frozen in mid-swing. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, stepped out onto her porch, her hands on her hips, her mouth a thin line of disapproval. Then they saw her, sitting beside him in the carriage. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the dusty air. The whispers started immediately, a low, venomous hum like angry wasps. They were not quiet whispers. They were meant to be heard. "Look, it is the Wade girl. He brought her back, dressed like a lady now. Wonder what she had to do for that. Looks just like the last one. Does she not, poor thing?" Poor thing, she made her bed, went with the murderer for a bit of coin. Eleanor felt a hot flush of shame and anger creep up her neck. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, the edges of the locket digging into her palm. She could feel Silas stiffen beside her. He made no sign that he had heard, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but she saw the muscle ticking in his jaw. The carriage stopped before the general store. The driver, the same stoic man from that first day, opened the door. Silas stepped out, his tall frame casting a long, intimidating shadow in the midday sun. He turned and, for the first time in public, offered her his hand. It was a deliberate, defiant gesture, a statement to the entire town. She took it, his grip firm and steady, and allowed him to help her down. They stood together for a moment, a united front against the hostile, watching eyes of Clearwater. They ignored the whispers and went about their business. At the lumber mill, Silas spoke with the owner, his voice all crisp, professional command as he placed a large order. Eleanor stood quietly by his side, her presence a silent challenge to the curious workers who kept stealing glances at her. Then, they walked to the general store. The air inside was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured meat, and unspoken judgment. Mrs. Gable served them with a grudging, tight-lipped efficiency, her eyes constantly darting from Silas's cold, impassive face to Eleanor's. It was as they were leaving the store, their arms laden with parcels, that the real trouble found them. A man stepped out of the saloon and blocked their path. He was a portly man with a florid, pockmarked face and small, greedy eyes. He reeked of stale whiskey and self-importance. Eleanor recognized him instantly. Jedediah Croft, a man to whom her uncle had owed a considerable sum, a man whose threats had been the final catalyst for her sale. "Well, well," Croft said, a sneering smile spreading across his face. "If it is not the Baron of Black Ridge himself, gracing us with his presence, and look what he has got with him. The little Wade filly, all cleaned up." Silas stopped, his body going utterly still. "You are in my way," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Croft laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. He was playing to the crowd, which was now gathering at a safe distance, eager for a confrontation. "Oh, I think you have got time for a little chat. See, I had a business arrangement with this girl's uncle. A debt was owed, a debt that was settled by selling her to you." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Eleanor's feet. "Seems to me, a man of your standing, buying up a poor man's niece. Well, it looks bad, very bad. People might get the wrong idea. They might think you make a habit of it." The insinuation was clear, and it was vile. He was linking Eleanor's sale to the dark, unspoken rumors about Lillian. He was trying to extort them, to blackmail them with public shame. "They might even think," Croft continued, his voice rising, "that a man who cannot keep one wife alive might have to resort to buying his next one. A man like that would probably pay a handsome sum to keep folks quiet. Would he not?" The crowd murmured, their suspicion and morbid curiosity fanned by Croft's ugly words. This was it, the town's long-simmering judgment, brought to a boil by a petty, greedy man. Silas took a step forward, his eyes turning to chips of gray ice. "One more word," he growled, "and you will regret it." But before he could do anything else, Eleanor stepped in front of him, placing a hand on his arm. She turned to face Jedediah Croft, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was terrified, but beneath the terror was a bedrock of cold, hard fury. They would not do this to him. She would not let them. She had been silent when they sold her. She would not be silent now. She looked directly into Croft's small, cruel eyes. "You are right about one thing, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden silence. "A debt was owed. A debt my uncle could not pay because men like you prey on the weak." She then turned her gaze from Croft to the faces in the crowd, the silent witnesses. And you are right about another thing. I was sold in this very square, sold like a horse, for a pouch of coins and a silver dollar. And do you know what the worst part of that day was? She let the question hang in the air. It was not the shame. It was the silence. It was the fact that every single one of you stood and watched it happen. You watched a man sell his own blood, and you did nothing. You looked away. A wave of unease rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Gable had the decency to look down at her shoes. Mr. Abernathy's grim expression tightened. She had turned their judgment back on them. She turned back to Croft. You talk about what this man has done. Let me tell you what he has done. He took me from a town that offered me no help and no hope. And he gave me a home. He has shown me more kindness and decency than I have ever known from anyone in this miserable, dusty place. You whisper about his wife. You call him a murderer because you are small. Frightened people who cannot comprehend a grief greater than your own petty concerns. You know nothing of his heart, but I do. The words poured out of her, fueled by a righteous anger she did not know she possessed. She was no longer afraid. She was a woman defending her life, her choices, and the honor of the man she had come to, the man she cared for. So you can stand here and try to wring a few dollars out of your own pathetic cowardice, she finished, her voice ringing with contempt. But you will not get a single cent from us, and you will not speak his name again. For a long moment, the entire street was utterly silent. Jedediah Croft stood there, his sneer frozen on his face, his bluff called in the most public way imaginable. He had expected a cowering girl and an angry, silent man. He had not expected this articulate fury, this absolute defense. He looked to the crowd for support, but he found none. Their eyes were on Eleanor, filled not with suspicion, but with a new, grudging respect. The spell was broken when the town sheriff, a tall, weary man named Miller, stepped forward. He looked at Croft with utter disgust. I think you have said your piece. Jed, now move along before you cause a real disturbance. Croft, his face a mottled red, opened his mouth to protest, but he saw the look in the sheriff's eyes and the cold, deadly promise in Silas' veins. His cowardly nature took over. He spat one last time in the dust, muttered a curse under his breath, and shuffled back into the saloon, defeated. The crowd began to disperse, talking in low, hushed tones. The nature of the whispers had changed. They were no longer malicious, but awed. As Eleanor and Silas walked toward their carriage, Sheriff Miller tipped his hat to them. It was a small gesture, but it was a sea change. It was an apology. It was an acceptance. Silas helped her into the carriage, his touch lingering on her hand for a moment longer than necessary. As they pulled away, she looked back at Clearwater. It was still the same dusty, weathered town, but something fundamental had shifted. It no longer had any power over her. The ride back up the mountain was quiet, but it was a different silence once again. It was the silence of a battle won, of a truth spoken aloud. As the manor came into view, its gray stone warmed by the late afternoon sun, it looked less like a fortress and more like a home. When the carriage stopped in the courtyard, Silas turned to her. He reached out, not for her hand, but to gently touch the silver locket at her throat. His thumb brushed against her skin. "What you did back there," he began, his voice thick with an emotion she could not quite name. "No one has ever done that for me. You are not alone anymore." "Silas," she whispered. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the last of his defenses seemed to melt away. The man who had been defined by loss, judged by rumor, and isolated by grief, was no longer isolated. The woman he had bought to be a ghost had become his staunchest defender. In the eyes of the town, she had become the Lady of Black Ridge, but in his own eyes, she had become something far more important. The winter that followed was long and deep, a season of quiet healing where the mountain seemed to hold its breath under a thick blanket of snow. The world was reduced to the warm, fire-lit spaces within the stone walls of the manor, the sharp edges of memory, both of the fire and of the confrontation in town, softened with the passing of time, replaced by the steady, comfortable rhythm of a shared life. The foundations of the new stable were laid before the first heavy snow, a promise of rebuilding buried under the frost, waiting for the thaw. And then spring came to Blackridge. It did not arrive gently, but with a fierce, vibrant insistence. The snow receded from the lower slopes first, revealing the rich, dark earth, and a tide of green slowly crept its way up the mountain. The streams, choked with ice for months, broke free with a joyful roar. Birds returned, their songs filling the air that had been empty for so long. Eleanor's garden, which had slept under a protective layer of mulch, exploded with life. The poppies and columbine returned, more brilliant than before, a splash of defiant color against the ancient gray stone. The house, once a silent fortress of grief, now echoed with the sounds of life. The windows were thrown open to the clean, pine-scented air. The new stable was finished, its stalls filled with the horses that had survived the fire and a few new ones purchased from a rancher 2 valleys over. Their contented nickering and the soft thud of their hooves on fresh straw became the new heartbeat of the estate. Harris, the old, silent steward of the manor's secrets, seemed to have shed a decade of weariness. He moved with a lighter step, and his smile, once a shocking rarity, was now a frequent visitor to his wrinkled face. He took to tending Eleanor's garden with a quiet, paternal pride, his gnarled hands surprisingly gentle as he staked a leaning poppy or pulled a stubborn weed. Sometimes, Eleanor would be working in the library and would hear a sound that had been absent from the house for longer than anyone could remember: laughter. It was never loud or boisterous, but a low, shared chuckle between her and Silas over a line in a book, or a wry observation he made about one of his business correspondents. It was the sound of the ice finally breaking. The bond between Eleanor and Silas was no longer a thing of dramatic confessions or life-threatening events. It had settled into the kind of profound, unspoken understanding that is deeper than any declaration. They did not speak of love. The words felt too small, too clumsy for the vast, quiet space they had built together. Love was in the way he would look up from his ledgers when she entered the room, a warmth entering his gray eyes that was reserved only for her. It was in the way she would bring him a cup of coffee without asking, knowing from the set of his shoulders that he was tired. It was in the long, comfortable silences they shared on the stone veranda in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the distant peaks, the sky turning from gold to a deep, bruised purple, a simple, contented quiet, worlds away from the oppressive, fearful silence that had once filled the house. Eleanor's own heart had found its peace. The tormenting question of whether her feelings were born of pity or gratitude had faded with the winter snows. She knew now that what she felt was real. It was not a debt of gratitude for her life, nor was it sympathy for his past. It was love for the man himself, for his quiet strength, his hidden gentleness, his wounded but resilient heart. She had come to understand that the circumstances of their meeting, the ugly transaction in the town square, were merely the tangled, thorny path that had, against all odds, led them here. It did not define them. Their truth, the one they had forged in fire and shadow, was their own. One bright spring morning, when the air was so clear it felt as if you could reach out and touch the farthest mountain, Eleanor knew there was one last thing she had to do. She left Silas overseeing the training of a new colt in the paddock and walked back into the house. She moved with a quiet purpose, her steps echoing softly in the great hall. She did not hesitate at the junction. She walked directly to the west wing. The corridor was no longer a place of chilling drafts and palpable sorrow. With the rest of the house now filled with light and air, it was just a hallway, shadowed and still, but no longer menacing. The door to Lillian's chambers was unlocked. She pushed it open. A shaft of light from the hall window cut across the dusty floor. The white sheets still covered the furniture like sleeping ghosts. The room was a time capsule of a life interrupted. She walked to the great window, the one that looked out over the steep, unforgiving ravine where Lillian had met her end. She took the heavy, velvet curtains in her hands, the fabric stiff and cold, and with a great heave, pulled them back. Sunlight flooded the room. It was an explosion of brilliant zenni, cleansing light that chased the last of the shadows from the corners and set a billion dust motes dancing like tiny, golden stars. The light fell upon the overturned inkwell, the silver-backed brush, the little leather-bound diary on the nightstand. It illuminated them not as objects of tragedy, but simply as things of the past, their power to haunt nullified by the simple, honest light of day. Eleanor was not afraid. She felt only a deep, quiet sense of peace, a final release. This was not about erasing Lillian. It was about allowing her, and the house, and Silas, to finally be free of her ghost. She opened the window, and a gentle breeze, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, swirled into the room, the first fresh air it had known in 5 long years. She had let the light in. The house could finally, completely, breathe again. She left the room, leaving the door and the curtains open, and walked back out into the brilliant sunshine of the courtyard. Silas was there, having finished with the colt. He was leaning against the fence of the new paddock, watching her approach. The sunlight caught in his dark hair, and the lines of grief that had been so deeply etched into his face seemed to have softened. He was not smiling, but an expression of profound peace rested on his features. He saw her, and his eyes met hers across the courtyard. In that look, everything was said. The gratitude, the shared history, the quiet, unshakable certainty of their future. It was a promise, a vow, a homecoming, all contained in a single, silent gaze. Eleanor stopped in the center of the courtyard, the sun warm on her face, the sounds of the living, breathing manor all around her. She thought of the frightened, angry girl who had been sold for a handful of coins in a dusty town square. She thought of the journey that had brought her through fear and fire, through darkness and grief, to this single, perfect moment of peace. She was home. She had been sold like property, but in the heart of the man everyone feared. She found freedom. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.